thank you for coming, everyone. I'm going to talk about the past, present, and future benefits of shark diving tourism in Semporna, Malaysia. This is a study I've been doing with Marit Kracht and my external supervisor, Mark Meakin, from the Australian Institute of Marine Science. So first of all, I'd like to give you some overview about the background of different usages of sharks. So probably historically more relevant are shark fisheries. Those are quite extensive globally, which has driven an overexploitation of many shark populations worldwide. It's estimated that about 100 million sharks are caught every year for fisheries. And so this has some ecological impacts because sharks play quite an important role in marine ecosystems, but also socioeconomic impacts on fisheries when shark populations collapse, but then also on the tourism. And that's basically the second sector that I want to talk about today, and I will focus my talk on. So that's shark diving tourism, and that's a more recent industry of people basically going down in the water and looking at sharks. Yes, and so this has, there has been some socioeconomic benefits identified in relation to that. First of all, in comparison to the fisheries, this has a renewable value because you can watch a shark several times over its lifespan, whereas you can just catch it once and you can sell the fins or the meat, and that's just a one-time price, where you can watch the shark over and over again underwater, and people pay for that. And so there are related business and tax revenues with that, and it creates jobs in areas which might be alternative livelihoods to former fishermen. And so there's been an argument for shark and ray conservation in several places. And these revenues can be quite substantial in a number of areas. These are just a couple of examples where shark and ray diving tourism generate quite a bit of revenue, business revenues in the areas. And these areas are usually also areas where shark and ray fisheries are banned. So these are called shark sanctuaries, and basically that means that fisheries of sharks and rays are banned in the entire exclusive economic zone of these countries. And so what we try to do in this one is estimate the business revenues for shark and ray diving in Sabah, which is a state in the Malaysian Borneo. So the situation in Sabah at the moment is that there are 6 marine protected areas. One of them is the Sipadan Island Park, which you can see here on the picture. And this is at the same time a very famous shark diving site. So a lot of people go there annually to see sharks underwater. But outside these marine protected areas where shark fisheries are banned, there are places, well, basically all of these places you can still fish for sharks, and this has quite a lot of implications for the shark populations, obviously, but then also for the tourism. So as you can see, for example, here, this picture shows some rays, manta rays and mobile rays being cut up, and this picture has been taken by a tourist on one of the neighboring islands of Sipadan out of the hotel room. So you can imagine that if you go to a place and you want to watch these sharks and rays alive, that then if you open up your window and you see a scene like that, that creates quite a big conflict between the tourism and the fishery sectors in these places. And so yeah, so as a consequence, the government of Sabah wanted to know what's the revenues of tourism in these places, and is considering basically to ban entirely shark fishing and ray fishing in all the waters of Sabah. So what we wanted to know is what the current economic value of shark diving tourism is in Semporna. I'm saying here shark diving, but whenever I say shark, I mean shark and ray, just to make it shorter. I wanted to know what the implementation, how the implementation of a shark sanctuary could influence the dive trip demand of tourists in Semporna. what the economic consequences of this dive trip demand is if it changes the economy in the place. And then also I wanted to know what the willingness to pay for a tourist user fee is that could potentially then finance the shark and ray sanctuary. So to find that out, I went to Semporna, which is one region within Sabah. And I made a data collection in February 2018. I looked at 4 different sites: Sipadan Island Park, Mabul, Semporna Town, and Pom Pom Island. And I did 11 dive operator surveys where I was looking at employments of dive guides. And then I've done 451 dive tourist surveys, which we're doing on digital tablets, as you can see here in the pictures. And these surveys, we looked at 2 sections. One was a revealed preferences method, where we looked basically at the number of dive trips that people did in the last 5 years to the place. We asked them about their travel expenses to estimate their the business revenues. We looked at a couple of tourists' characteristics like age, satisfaction with the trip. We asked them to rank their interests in different animals. And then we did used the travel cost method to estimate the dive trip demand of people. And then the second section was a stated preferences method, where we basically looked then at the future tourist behavior. For that, we asked them about the number of dive trips they would do to Semporna in the next 5 years. And that was contingent to first the status quo. So we asked them, how many times would you come back in the next 5 years, given that everything's exactly as it is at the moment. And we then presented them a scenario of a shark sanctuary. And that was described as potentially potentially could increase the shark and ray abundance in the area, that it could increase the species diversity that they observe underwater, and that also the number of shark and ray dive spots could increase that they could visit. And then we did a negative binomial model to look at the change in the dive trip demand between these 2 scenarios and the change in business revenues. And lastly, we had a willingness to pay study to look at the willingness to pay for this user fee. So we're looking at tourist preferences. We found out that sharks and rays were the most, dive tourists were the most interested in seeing sharks and rays in comparison to other animals like a high fish abundance, turtles, coral reefs, or macrolife. Macrolife is like seahorses and small critters basically underwater. And when we also asked them if they would return to the area if there wouldn't be any sharks. And 60% would return, 40% said they would not return, and 29% in total said that they would not return and instead go off to other dive tourist sites, so to substitute sites. And this we called them basically shark divers, and we used that as the most conservative estimate of what could be lost to substitute sites. So we found revenues of all dive tourists on local businesses, and that included not only dive tourism businesses, but also hotels, restaurants, souvenir shops, and domestic transportation. And that yielded $55.3 million a year to the Semporna region. And then looking only at shark divers, so this is the 29% of this basically, that was $16.6 million a year that could be lost to substitute sites. And also, and looking only on dive business, so that's basically just a fraction of that. yielded 6.4 million US dollars a year. So that would be lost to dive businesses if there were no sharks and rays. And then we compared these numbers, or actually just the first number, to the future scenarios, and we used the number of all divers, because we asked all divers about their future behavior, not only shark divers. So so this 55.3 million is basically what we've seen before. That is the observed value in the last 5 years, and that corresponded to a total of 10 days that they stayed in a median in the last 5 years per person. And then under the status quo, we estimated that they would stay, 8 days in the next 5 years, which would yield 44.2 million US dollars. And we then compared that with the shark sanctuary scenario. And in that scenario, people would stay 12 days in total in the next 5 years. And the negative binomial model showed a significant increase in the trip demand as well, of 40%. And that could then increase the business revenues to 41.9 million US dollars a year. So looking at the jobs and salaries, we found that 796 employees were employed directly from shark diving tourism, and actually don't have that number here right now, but it's been quite substantial. I think the entire population was 35,000 people in the region, so that's roughly 2% of the population in the area is employed only by shark diving, which is quite substantial. They had an aggregated salary of 2.8 million US dollars a year, and about 91% of employees were Malaysian locals, and that is quite uncommon to say, because many times these sort of industries employ a lot of foreign people because they have better skills, they speak better English or so. But in this case, 91% of the employees actually were locals, so these revenues actually go to local people. But then also, unfortunately, we found quite strong inequalities between different ethnic groups. So there are a couple of refugee groups that come from the Philippines, and they live often on the water or in very poor conditions, as you can see here. And they basically depend on subsistence fisheries, and they don't have any permits to work or stay in the area. So that means that these people are completely excluded from all the benefits that the diving tourism industry brings, which, obviously when they then go off and either use very destructive fisheries methods or fish for sharks and rays, that has strong implications for the shark diving industry. And so that is one point that the government certainly has to work on to find a solution. Then looking at the contingent valuation study, we did an interval regression and found an average willingness to pay per tourist and day of 9.5 US dollars, and that could yield a potential annual revenues of 2.7 million US dollars a year that could be available to support local communities and enforcement of new regulations. So to conclude, the shark diving industry in Semporna generates quite substantial economic benefits to local communities. The implementation of a shark sanctuary could increase local businesses by about 40%, and the tourist user fee could generate about 2.7 million US dollar annually to add financing a potential shark sanctuary in Sabah. And with that, I'd like to thank all the institutions that's been involved, all my supervisors, Dave Pannell, Mara Kracht, Abby Rogers, for helping with this, with my thesis and with everything. Yeah, questions.